I never imagined that a simple Thanksgiving dinner would turn into the most satisfying revenge of my entire life. My name is Haley. I am 32 years old. The air inside the dining room of our sprawling Austin estate felt heavy enough to crush me as I sat beneath the crystal chandelier while more than 20 relatives stared with open disdain. My father abruptly rose from his seat at the head of the table to silence the room by tapping his spoon against a wine glass before declaring that he had prepared a special lesson for his youngest daughter. He carelessly tossed a thick manila envelope onto the center of the table, with a loud thud that echoed against the silence, revealing the handwritten inscription which cruelly stated 12 reasons why you do not deserve to carry our family name. My husband tried to intervene, but I reached out to tear open the seal because I needed to see the depths of their hatred, scanning through lines filled with petty lies until my eyes froze on reason number 6. I slowly lifted my gaze to lock eyes with my older sister across the table, watching her arrogant smirk instantly vanish as her face drained of all color. She realized in that terrifying moment that the accusation written on that paper was actually the spark that would burn her fake life to the ground. Before I reveal the secret that destroyed my sister's reputation and caused my family's total collapse, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button if you want to see justice served. To understand exactly why reason number 6 terrified her so much, we need to return to a rainy Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks prior to that night inside my quiet apartment. My husband Ethan and I had finally purchased our dream home in the suburbs after 5 years of sacrificing vacations and saving every single penny we earned from our respective jobs. We valued our peace and financial security above all else because we knew how easily it could disappear if we were not careful with our spending habits. This stability felt incredibly foreign compared to the chaotic environment I grew up in with my parents and sister, where money was always used as a tool for emotional manipulation. Ethan often reminded me that we had successfully broken the toxic cycle of dysfunction by building a life based on honesty and hard work rather than keeping up false appearances. The tranquility of my Tuesday afternoon shattered when I received a frantic text message from my older sister Paula, insisting that we meet immediately at a secluded cafe on the edge of town. I walked into the establishment to find Paula wearing oversized sunglasses to hide her swollen eyes, which was a shocking departure from her usual glamorous appearance. She waited until the waitress walked away before she broke down into hysterical sobs that drew the unwanted attention of nearby tables. Paula confessed in a hushed whisper that she had lost everything in a series of high-risk cryptocurrency schemes and owed dangerous private lenders over $250,000. I sat back in my chair in absolute disbelief because my parents constantly bragged to everyone that Paula was a real estate genius who was making millions of dollars every year. She reached across the table to grip my wrist with desperate strength while pleading for me to access the equity in my new home to save her from financial ruin. Paula explained that she needed the money immediately because our parents Roger and Beverly would disown her if they found out their golden child was actually a total failure. I pulled my hand away to tell her firmly that Ethan and I would never jeopardize our home to fix her reckless gambling addiction. She continued to weep and beg until I finally offered a compromise because I could not bear to see my own sister in such a pathetic state of distress. I told her I would loan her a small amount to cover the immediate interest payments, but she had to sign a formal document acknowledging the debt. Paula looked furious that I was treating this like a business transaction, but she eventually nodded because she knew she had no other options left. I made her write down the terms on a piece of notebook paper right there in the coffee shop to ensure she could not deny this conversation later. My relief at handling the situation responsibly evaporated the moment I stepped out of the cafe and saw my mother Beverly calling my phone. I answered expecting a casual greeting, but was immediately hit with a barrage of insults about how I was cold and unfeeling toward my struggling sister. My mother screamed that I needed to step up for the family by covering the $5,000 catering bill for the upcoming Thanksgiving party. She claimed that paying for the party was the only way to make up for the fact that I had upset Paula during our meeting and hurt her feelings. I stood on the sidewalk gripping my phone as the realization of what just happened washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Paula had evidently called our mother the second I went to the restroom to twist the narrative and paint herself as a victim of my cruelty. It was a manipulative tactic they had used against me for years to squeeze money out of my bank account whenever Paula made a mistake. I realized in that moment that Paula had no intention of changing her behavior because she knew our mother would always be there to bully me into compliance. The most painful part was knowing that my mother did not even ask for my side of the story before demanding $5,000. She simply assumed that Paula was the innocent victim who needed protection, while I was the villain who needed to pay for the privilege of being in the family. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming the truth about the $250,000 debt because I had promised Paula I would keep her secret for now. I agreed to pay for the party just to get my mother off the phone so I could go home and process the betrayal I had just experienced. This cycle of financial abuse had to end somewhere, but I did not know yet that the upcoming party would be the finale. 2 weeks before the party that would end our family, Ethan and I drove over to my parents' estate under the pretense of discussing the Thanksgiving menu, though we all knew the real reason for the visit was to hand over the $5,000 check they had demanded. My stomach churned with a familiar mixture of dread and resentment as we pulled into the long, winding driveway that led to the house where I had spent a childhood, feeling like an outsider. Ethan reached across the center console to squeeze my hand in a silent gesture of support because he knew exactly how toxic these mandatory family gatherings could be for my mental health. I took a deep breath to steel myself for the inevitable criticism about my appearance or my career choice, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight that awaited us parked right in front of the garage. A brand new candy apple red Tesla Model S Plaid sat gleaming under the afternoon sun like a trophy, its polished surface reflecting the distorted faces of my parents, who were circling it with expressions of pure adoration. My father Roger was running his hand along the sleek hood of the vehicle with a look of pride I had never seen directed at me, while my mother Beverly clapped her hands together in delight. My heart hammered against my ribs because I knew exactly how much that car cost, and the math simply did not add up given the desperate conversation I had with my sister just 7 days prior. Paula stepped out of the driver's seat wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, tossing her hair back with the confidence of a woman who owned the world. She spotted our modest sedan pulling up behind her luxury electric vehicle and flashed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It was a little bonus to myself for closing the downtown deal," Paula announced loud enough for the neighbors to hear her voice dripping with false modesty. "A successful businesswoman needs a ride that commands respect, don't you think?" I felt the blood drain from my face as I stepped out of the car, my mind racing back to the tearful confession in the coffee shop where she claimed she was drowning in $250,000 of debt. I watched my father pull her into a crushing hug, telling her that she deserved every bit of luxury for her hard work and brilliance. The injustice of the situation made me physically nauseous, because I was currently holding a check to pay for their party while she was buying six-figure cars with money she likely borrowed or stole. I waited until our parents were distracted by the interior features of the Tesla before I grabbed Paula's arm and dragged her forcefully toward the seclusion of the rose garden in the backyard. She tried to pull away, but I held on tight because I needed answers before I exploded right there on the driveway. "You have got to be kidding me, Paula," I hissed, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You stood in front of me last week crying about owing dangerous people $250,000. How on earth did you pay for a $100,000 car?" Paula rolled her eyes as if I were a child asking a stupid question, pulling a compact mirror out of her purse to check her lipstick. She explained with infuriating calmness that the car was a lease she acquired using a new line of credit because she needed to maintain the appearance of wealth to attract new investors to pay off the old debts. She called it strategic leverage and accused me of having a poverty mindset that prevented me from understanding how real wealth was generated. Before I could point out that her strategy was actually called fraud, the back door of the house slammed open. Roger marched across the lawn with a face like a thundercloud, having spotted our tense exchange from the kitchen window. He did not ask what we were arguing about, nor did he care to hear my side of the story. "You just cannot stand to see her happy, can you?" Roger shouted, pointing a shaking finger in my face, while Paula shrank behind him to play the victim. "Your sister buys herself something nice after working her fingers to the bone, and the first thing you do is drag her back here to make her feel guilty. It is pure jealousy, Haley, and it is ugly." I stood there with my mouth open, unable to defend myself against the absurdity of his accusation without revealing Paula's secret. Paula peeked out from behind our father's shoulder and gave me a look that was equal parts warning and pleading. She knew I held the power to destroy her right then and there, but she also knew I was too conditioned to seek my father's approval to cause a scene. The dinner that followed was less of a meal and more of a tribunal, where my character was systematically dismantled, while Paula was canonized as a saint. My mother placed the turkey on the table and immediately launched into a monologue about how generous Paula was for bringing expensive wine, conveniently forgetting the $5,000 check I had silently placed on the counter. They compared Paula's bold investments to my timid savings, mocking the fact that Ethan and I cooked at home instead of dining at five-star restaurants. "Paula understands that money is meant to be enjoyed and shared with family," Beverly said, pouring more wine into my sister's glass. "Unlike some people who hoard every cent and still act like contributing to a family holiday is a burden." I looked at Ethan, who was gripping his fork so hard his knuckles were white, and I signaled him that it was time to leave before I said something I couldn't take back. We stood up abruptly, leaving our meals half-eaten, and muttered a quick excuse about an early morning meeting. My parents didn't even stand up to walk us to the door because they were too busy fawning over Paula's plan to renovate their guest house. As we walked back to our car, passing the gleaming red Tesla that represented everything wrong with this family, I made a decision that felt heavy in my chest. I could have turned around and told them about the debt, the lies, and the dangerous loans, but I knew they wouldn't believe me without proof. I decided to keep her dirty secret for one last time, not to protect her, but because I knew that when the truth finally came out, I wanted it to be undeniable. I wanted them to see the paperwork with their own eyes so they could never call me a liar again. I swallowed my pride, got into my car, and drove away into the night, leaving them to their delusions for just a little while longer. 1 week before the day that would permanently shatter our family image, I was sitting in my office reviewing landscape blueprints when my receptionist buzzed to say I had an unexpected visitor. I was surprised to see Aunt Brenda walking through the glass doors of my firm because she rarely ventured into the city. Brenda was the only member of my family who had ever shown me genuine kindness, but she was often too terrified of my mother's wrath to speak up in my defense. She looked nervously over her shoulder as she sat down across from my desk, clutching her purse as if she were smuggling state secrets instead of simply visiting her niece. Brenda declined my offer of coffee and leaned in close to whisper that she had stopped by to warn me about the upcoming Thanksgiving dinner. She revealed that she had gone over to my parents' house earlier that morning to help with preparations and had accidentally seen a document my mother was drafting on the kitchen counter. It was not a menu or a grocery list, but a detailed itinerary of grievances titled "The Intervention," which outlined exactly how they planned to humiliate me. Brenda explained with trembling hands that my mother Beverly had invited business partners, distant cousins, and old family friends specifically to serve as an audience for this public shaming. My aunt pleaded with me to make up an excuse to skip the party because she believed my parents were setting a trap to destroy my reputation in front of everyone we knew. She told me that Roger and Beverly were telling people that I was mentally unstable and financially irresponsible, and they planned to use this intervention to legally cut me out of the family trust while elevating Paula as the sole beneficiary. I listened to her words with a cold numbness spreading through my chest because I had suspected they hated me, but I never imagined they would orchestrate such a calculated attack. I went home that evening and relayed the entire conversation to Ethan while we stood in our kitchen making dinner. Ethan immediately slammed his knife down on the cutting board and insisted that we simply refuse to attend the party. He argued that subjecting ourselves to their abuse was unnecessary and that we should let them eat their turkey alone in their miserable mansion. He was protective and logical, wanting to shield his wife from further pain, but I shook my head slowly because I knew that running away would only validate their lies. If I did not show up, they would spin a narrative about how I was too ashamed or unstable to face the family, and I would be the villain forever. I told Ethan that I was done hiding and done protecting the fragile egos of people who would happily throw me to the wolves. I went into our home office and opened the fireproof safe where we kept our most important documents. I was not going to bring a bottle of wine or a festive dessert to this Thanksgiving dinner. Instead, I pulled out a crisp manila folder that would serve as my luggage for this trip into the lion's den. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously organizing every piece of evidence I had gathered over the last 3 weeks. I placed the handwritten loan agreement Paula had signed in the coffee shop right on top, ensuring her signature was clearly visible. Underneath that, I stacked the bank statements showing the thousands of dollars I had transferred to my parents over the years, proving that I was the one supporting them, not the other way around. I included the printed screenshots of Paula's text messages, where she admitted to the gambling debts and the fraudulent loan applications. This folder was not just paperwork to me. It was the shield I would use to deflect their blows, and the sword I would use to cut the cords binding me to them. As I was sealing the folder, my phone buzzed on the desk with a new message notification from Paula. I picked it up to see a text that read, "Don't do anything stupid to ruin my big night on Thursday because Mom and Dad are finally proud of me, so just sit there and behave for once." I stared at the screen for a long moment, reading her arrogant words over and over again until they burned into my retinas. Paula truly believed she had won, thinking that her shiny new car and our parents' blind adoration would protect her from the consequences of her actions. She had no idea that she had just handed me the final ounce of resolve I needed to go through with my plan. I did not reply to her text, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't be said better in front of an audience. I turned off my phone, placed the folder by the front door, and prepared myself for the war that was coming. The humid Texas heat had finally surrendered to the cool darkness of the evening by the time Ethan and I pulled our car up to the front of my parents' sprawling estate on Thanksgiving night. The house was illuminated like a fortress against the night sky, with floodlights casting dramatic shadows across the manicured lawn, and string lights wrapped around every oak tree in a display that screamed for attention. It immediately became apparent that this was not going to be the intimate family gathering my mother had promised on the phone, but rather a full-scale gala designed to show off their wealth while publicly putting me in my place. Dozens of luxury cars were already lined up along the circular driveway, including Paula's gleaming red Tesla, which was parked prominently in the center like a shrine to her supposed success. Ethan reached over to squeeze my hand before we stepped out of the vehicle, offering me a silent reminder that we held the ultimate trump card in the leather bag slung over my shoulder. We walked up the stone path toward the massive double doors, which were already swung wide open to reveal a foyer crowded with people holding champagne flutes and laughing too loudly. The interior was decorated more like a wedding reception than a holiday dinner, with towering floral arrangements that blocked lines of sight and servers weaving through the crowd with silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. My parents were holding court near the grand staircase, looking like royalty, surveying their subjects as they accepted compliments from neighbors and business associates. My mother Beverly spotted us entering, and her smile instantly tightened into a thin line of disapproval as she raked her eyes over my appearance. I had chosen a sophisticated tailored navy dress that I paid for with my own money, feeling confident that it was appropriate for the occasion, but my mother clearly disagreed. She stepped away from her conversation to intercept us, leaning in to whisper a critique that was loud enough for the nearby guests to overhear. "I suppose that simple off-the-rack department store look is the best you can manage these days," she said, with a sympathetic tilt of her head that was pure venom. "It is a shame you didn't ask Paula for fashion advice, because at least she understands that you have to dress the part if you want people to respect you." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from responding, knowing that any defense I mounted would only be used as proof of my bad attitude. My father Roger joined her a moment later, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder that felt more like a restraint than a greeting. He gestured toward Paula, who was holding court in the living room, wearing a sequined gold gown that looked ridiculous for a home dinner, but perfectly matched the ostentatious vibe of the evening. "Your sister is wearing a dress from the new collection in Paris, because real success wears its price tag for the world to see," Roger declared with a booming laugh, slapping Ethan on the back a little too hard. "Maybe if you two focused less on pinching pennies and more on taking big risks like Paula, you wouldn't look so out of place in a room full of winners." I scanned the room and realized with a sinking heart that the guest list had been curated with malicious precision to maximize my discomfort. I saw my father's business partners who had been told I was the lazy daughter, distant cousins, who only knew the lies my mother fed them on Facebook, and old family friends who looked at me with pitying eyes. These people were not here to celebrate Thanksgiving. They were the jury my parents had assembled for the trial they were about to conduct against me. Every whisper and side-eye directed at me felt like a physical blow, confirming Aunt Brenda's warning that this was a premeditated ambush. We were eventually ushered into the formal dining room, where a table long enough to seat 30 people had been set with the family's finest china and crystal stemware. Ethan and I were directed to seats near the foot of the table, far away from the head where my parents sat, but directly across from Paula. The air in the room was thick with tension as the servers began placing elaborate appetizers of foie gras and truffle mousse in front of guests who barely touched them. Once everyone was seated, Roger tapped his fork against his glass to silence the room, a self-satisfied grin stretching across his face as he prepared to speak. He did not offer a traditional prayer or a toast to health, but instead launched into a passive-aggressive monologue about the nature of loyalty and debt. "It is a tragedy when children take and take from their parents without ever learning the value of giving back or showing respect." Roger announced, his eyes locking directly onto mine down the length of the table. "We are blessed to have a daughter like Paula who honors this family with her achievements, unlike others who believe the world owes them a living." A ripple of uncomfortable silence moved through the room as everyone turned to look at me, understanding exactly who the target of his speech was. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, but I refused to look down at my plate because that would be an admission of guilt I did not feel. Instead, I focused my gaze entirely on Paula, who was conspicuously avoiding looking at anyone. My sister was vibrating with nervous energy, her eyes darting around the room as if she were looking for an emergency exit. She was already on her third glass of white wine before the main course had even been served, drinking with a desperate urgency that betrayed her internal panic. She knew that I was sitting there with the knowledge of her $250,000 debt, and every time our father praised her success, she flinched as if he had struck her. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the glass to her lips, and for a brief moment our eyes met. I saw fear in her expression, raw, unfiltered terror, but she quickly looked away and signaled the waiter for a refill, trying to drown the reality that was about to crash down on her. The stage was set, the audience was seated, and my parents had just started the show, completely unaware that they had handed the leading role to the wrong daughter. When the turkey platters had been cleared away and the guests were settling back with their digestives, the atmosphere in the dining room shifted perceptibly from festive to ominous. My father raised his hand to signal the catering staff to cut the background music, plunging the expansive room into a silence that felt sudden and suffocating. He pushed his chair back with a scraping sound that made several guests wince before standing up in the center of the room, positioning himself directly under the chandelier so the light caught the silver in his hair. He did not look like a father preparing to give a loving holiday toast. He looked like a prosecutor preparing to deliver a closing argument against a defendant he had already deemed guilty. Roger cleared his throat with a self-important rumble, surveying the faces of his business partners and extended family members to ensure he had their absolute, undivided attention. He began a speech that was clearly rehearsed, speaking in a low, grave tone about the heavy burden of parenting and the deep disappointment that comes when a child refuses to embrace the family's values of excellence and loyalty. He lamented the fact that while one of his daughters had soared to the heights of success, the other had chosen a path of mediocrity and stubborn defiance that threatened to tarnish the Miller name. I sat perfectly still with my hands clenched in my lap, feeling the heat of 30 stares burning into my skin as he painted a caricature of me as the ungrateful black sheep. He reached into the inside pocket of his dinner jacket and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope that seemed to pulse with malicious intent. Roger tossed it onto the glass table in front of me with a casual disdain that suggested the contents were too filthy for him to hold for long. I took the liberty of writing down a few things you need to hear, Haley. He announced, his voice booming off the vaulted ceiling. Since you refuse to listen to our advice in private, perhaps reading these truths aloud in front of this family will finally shame you into changing your behavior. Consider this an intervention for your own good. Ethan started to stand up, his face red with anger, but I placed a calming hand on his forearm because I knew that stopping now would only make me look weak. I picked up the heavy envelope, broke the wax seal, and pulled out the stationery, which was covered in my father's sharp, angular handwriting. The header read, 12 Reasons Why You Do Not Deserve to Carry Our Family Name. A title so melodramatic and cruel that I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. My father gestured impatiently for me to begin, so I took a deep breath and started to read the first 5 points, my voice shaking slightly, but gaining strength with every ridiculous word. Reason number 1 accused me of being emotionally distant because I refused to drive 3 hours every single Sunday to visit them, conveniently ignoring that I worked 60-hour weeks to pay my mortgage. Reason number 2 claimed I disrespected my mother because I did not display her artistic pottery in my modern home, framing my aesthetic preferences as a personal attack on her soul. The list continued with petty grievances labeling me as ungrateful for the childhood they provided and accusing me of ignoring their financial wisdom regarding my career choices. Reason number 5 was particularly stinging as I had to read aloud the sentence, "You are consumed by a pathetic jealousy toward your sister Paula because you cannot handle seeing her shine brighter than you ever will." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room as the guests reacted to the spectacle unfolding before them. Some of the distant cousins were snickering behind their napkins, clearly enjoying the drama as if it were a reality television show. Aunt Brenda looked like she was about to be sick, her face pale and horrified, while my mother sat with a smug, satisfied smile, nodding along as if I were reciting Holy Scripture. The humiliation was designed to be crushing, to strip me of my dignity until I was nothing more than a cautionary tale for the rest of the family. I turned the page to continue, and that was when my eyes landed on reason number 6. The words jumped out at me sharper and more dangerous than anything that had come before. I read the sentence in my head first, processing the immense irony of what my parents had written. Reason number 6. I said, my voice cutting through the whispers. You are a total failure who is drowning in debt, lacking the financial success, the reputation, and the brilliant business acumen of your sister Paula. The accusation hung in the air heavy and poisonous. My parents believed they had written the ultimate insult attacking my financial stability, which I had worked so hard to build while praising Paula's fictitious wealth. They had unwittingly handed me the perfect weapon. I stopped reading abruptly and slowly lowered the paper to the table. I did not look at my father, nor did I look at my mother. I turned my head slowly to lock eyes with Paula, who was sitting directly across from me. Paula had been smirking just moments before enjoying the show, but as the specific words, drowning in debt, and business acumen echoed in the silent room, her expression shattered. She froze with her wine glass halfway to her mouth, her eyes widening in panic as she realized the trap our parents had accidentally set for her. She knew that by accusing me of being in debt, our parents had just given me the justification to talk about real debt. She watched me reach down toward the leather bag at my feet, and in that second, the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost in a gold-sequined dress. She knew with absolute certainty that reason number 6 was the match that was about to burn her entire world to ash. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds that felt like an eternity suspended in time. Everyone in the room was holding their breath and waiting for me to dissolve into tears or storm out in humiliation just as my father had intended. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while my mother watched me with a predator's gaze to see if her poisonous words had finally broken my spirit. But instead of the shame, they desperately wanted to see a low and dry chuckle escaped my lips that grew into a cold laugh, which echoed strangely in the tense dining room. My father looked at me with a mixture of confusion and fury, because this was not the reaction he had scripted for his grand intervention. I tossed the offensive letter back onto the table where it landed right next to the crystal centerpiece. I stood up slowly to address them with a voice that was terrifyingly calm. You really believe that I am a failure because of debts I do not have yet. You worship Paula for her success, which is represented by that red car parked outside, I said while locking eyes with my mother. But tell me, Mom and Dad, do you actually know what currency purchased that vehicle? Paula let out a strangled cry of panic and scraped her chair violently against the hardwood floor as she attempted to lunge across the table to stop me. She looked like a wild animal cornered in a trap as she reached for the folder, but Ethan was faster and far more composed. He stood up immediately to block her path with his broad shoulders, holding his hand up gently but firmly to keep her from physically attacking me. Sit down and let her finish, Paula, Ethan said with a commanding authority that stunned the room into absolute stillness. With my sister restrained by her own cowardice and my husband's protection, I reached into my bag and withdrew the single sheet of notebook paper that Paula had signed in the coffee shop 3 weeks ago. I smoothed it out on the table so the ink was clearly visible under the chandelier light. This is a promissory note signed by your golden child, I announced to the room, making sure my voice carried to the back corners where the business partners were sitting. Paula is not a real estate tycoon making millions. She is currently drowning in $250,000 of high-interest debt caused by online gambling and failed cryptocurrency schemes. She begged me for money to pay off loan sharks, not to invest in a business. I watched the blood drain from my father's face as the number hung in the air like a physical weight. Roger snatched the paper from the table with trembling hands, desperate to prove that I was lying. He brought the document close to his face, squinting at the handwriting he had praised his entire life. Beside him, my mother leaned in, clutching her pearl necklace as if it were a lifeline. They stared at the signature at the bottom, the undeniable loops and curves of Paula's name that they had seen on birthday cards and report cards for 35 years. The illusion of their perfect family began to crack and crumble right before our eyes. The guests started whispering urgently to one another, and I saw several of my father's potential investors checking their watches and signaling to their wives that it was time to leave immediately. But the humiliation was not finished yet. Aunt Brenda, who had been shrinking in her seat for most of the night, suddenly found a reservoir of courage I did not know she possessed. She stood up from her chair, her hands shaking, but her jaw set with determination. "It is not just the lenders, Roger," Brenda said, her voice wavering but gaining strength as she spoke. "Paula has borrowed $4,000 from me. She borrowed $2,000 from cousin Mike last Christmas. She told us all to never tell you because you would be angry, but we all thought she was just having a temporary cash flow problem." My father looked up from the paper, his eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and horror as he realized the extent of the deception. The man who prided himself on control and reputation had been played for a fool by the very daughter he idolized. He turned slowly to look at Paula, who was now sobbing uncontrollably into her napkin. "Is this true?" Roger whispered, his voice sounding old and broken. "Did you buy that car with stolen money just to impress me?" Paula's sobbing turned into a shriek of defensive rage as she slammed her hands on the table, causing the wine glasses to rattle dangerously. The mask of the successful businesswoman completely fell away to reveal a frightened and immature child who had never been told, "No. I had to do it because you would never accept me if I wasn't perfect." Paula screamed, her face blotchy and distorted with ugly tears. "You put so much pressure on me to be the star while you treated Haley like garbage. I borrowed the money to keep up the image you wanted. This is your fault for making me terrified to be average." The room erupted into total chaos as accusations flew back and forth like shrapnel. My mother began to wail hysterically, clutching my father's arm, while Roger shouted at Paula to get out of his sight. The carefully curated Thanksgiving dinner had devolved into a circus of dysfunction, and for the first time in my life, I was not the one being trampled in the center ring. I stood there amidst the shouting and the crying, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a tragedy that I was no longer a part of. The truth was finally out, and it was far uglier than any lie they had ever told about me. 1 hour later, as we drove away from that house for the final time, the silence inside our car was not heavy or awkward, but felt incredibly peaceful, like the air after a violent storm. I watched the sprawling Austin landscape pass by the passenger window and felt a physical weight lifting off my shoulders that I had been carrying since I was a little girl trying to earn my father's love. Ethan reached over to hold my hand, his grip warm and steady, asking if I was okay or if I needed to pull over to cry. I shook my head slowly because I realized with sudden clarity that I had already shed my last tear for people who never truly cared about me. I pulled my phone out of my purse, the screen lighting up with a dozen missed calls from my mother, and I methodically blocked every single number associated with the Miller estate without a shred of guilt. The fallout from that dinner destroyed the carefully constructed image my family had maintained for decades, unraveling their lives with a speed that was almost terrifying to witness from a distance. We learned through Aunt Brenda that the consequences for Paula were immediate and brutal because the creditors she had been dodging finally caught up to her. Less than a week after the party, a tow truck arrived at my parents' driveway in the middle of the day to repossess the red Tesla while the neighbors watched from their front porches. Paula was evicted from her high-rise apartment downtown because she could no longer pay the rent with borrowed money, forcing her to move back into her childhood bedroom at the age of 35. She was no longer the glamorous real estate mogul she pretended to be on social media, but a grown woman with a gambling addiction who was now completely dependent on the parents she had humiliated. My parents suffered a different kind of ruin because their reputation in the local business community evaporated overnight, thanks to the gossip spread by the guests who witnessed the intervention. The investors my father had invited to the dinner immediately pulled their funding from his projects because they did not want to be associated with a family involved in fraud and public screaming matches. Roger and Beverly could no longer walk into their country club or their church without feeling the burning stares of people whispering about their fake wealth and their delinquent daughter. They had spent their entire lives trying to impress others, and in the end, they became the town's favorite cautionary tale about vanity and hubris. Roger tried to contact me one last time about a month after the incident, using a blocked number to leave a voicemail that was filled with his characteristic arrogance. He did not apologize or ask for forgiveness, but instead ordered me to come home and use my savings to help stabilize the family assets during this difficult transition. He spoke as if I were still the obedient little girl who would jump at the chance to fix their mistakes, completely unaware that the daughter he knew no longer existed. I did not return the call, nor did I feel the old pang of obligation to save them from the mess they created. I simply deleted the message, erased the number, and went back to cooking dinner with my husband in our peaceful, debt-free home. My life with Ethan blossomed in the absence of their toxicity, allowing us to focus on our careers and our marriage without the constant drain of emotional vampirism. We used the money I would have spent on their validation to take a beautiful trip to Italy, drinking wine on a balcony overlooking the ocean and toasting to our freedom. We are currently talking about starting our own family soon, and we have made a solemn vow that our children will never know what it feels like to be compared to a sibling or valued for their financial utility. I realized that by walking away from my biological family, I did not lose anything important. I actually gained the space to build a real family defined by unconditional love and mutual respect. The most important lesson I learned is that toxic parents often create their own worst nightmares through the dynamic of the golden child and the scapegoat. By shielding Paula from consequences and handing her everything she wanted, my parents actually crippled her ability to survive in the real world, while their harsh treatment of me ironically forced me to become strong, independent, and resilient. It is a reminder that true love involves accountability, and that constantly bailing someone out is not helping them. It is merely enabling their destruction. Another crucial realization is that you should never use money as a substitute for genuine connection or use it to paper over the cracks in a broken relationship. My family believed that expensive cars and lavish parties were proof of their worth, but when the money ran out, they had no foundation of love to hold them together. Finally, please remember that cutting ties with toxic family members is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of survival. You are not required to set yourself on fire just to keep other people warm, even if those people share your DNA. Thank you so much for listening to my story and for staying with me until the very end of this difficult journey. If you have ever felt like the black sheep of your family,